For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
All right, looks like we are live, guys. Thank you so much to everybody in the audience. I know you guys are as excited as me. We've got the much anticipated show with well-known radio talk show host Bob Enyart. KGov.com is the home webpage of the long-running conservative talk show Bob Enyart Live and of Theology Thursday and the Creation Evolution program Real Science Radio. They have aired more than 6,000 radio and TV shows. You can even get Real Science Radio on iTunes, Feedburner, Spotify, Stitcher, and on TuneIn Radio. George? And just make sure, George, that you unmute yourself.
Sorry. Good morning from Australia.
Good morning.
Is it up to me standing or?
Yeah. I've got a brief introduction for you there.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for being here, Bob. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I recall listening to quite a few of your videos and some of your podcasts. I would also like to add that you can also get BEL, which is an acronym for Bob Enyart Radio, on Alexa by simply saying, Alexa, open Bob Enyart Live. That's very easy. For those that aren't aware, Bob has had numerous debates with well-known evolutionists. Yes, it's Aaron Ra, Michael Shermer, Lawrence Krauss, I believe, as well. And he has also interviewed numerous outstanding scientists such as Doctors Walt Brown, Jonathan Safadi, Kevin Anderson, which we had a few weeks back, Stephen Meyer, and Michael Behe, who dare to challenge today's accepted creed that nothing created everything. How can people believe that? I'm flabbergasted. Now, much more about Bob can be found directly on his website, kgov.com or rsr.org, I believe.
Yeah.
Bob, I want to give you the floor for a brief introduction, and please correct me or on anything I may have said or SFT has said. So I'll give you the floor, Bob, and give us a little introduction and correct us on any mistakes that we've made.
No, that was all great. So I'm speaking to the Bond, right? George Bond.
You betcha. 007.
And Raw Matt and Standing for Truth. Am I allowed to use your off the internet name, Donnie?
Sure.
I just did. Hey, Donnie.
Hey, Bob. We're happy to have you. It's an honor. We are big fans, and we're really pumped for this, Bob. So thanks again for giving us your time. This is an important show, and everyone's excited for this. So thanks again.
Well, you're very welcome. It's an honor to be with you guys. Yeah, we've been on the air 5 days a week for 30 years on America's most powerful Christian radio station. It's 50,000 watts out of Denver. And so it's sharing the truth of Jesus Christ, the scriptures, and from a creation perspective, it is so powerful. And over all those years, decades, we have just been blessed to reach many entire families and people in churches sometimes with the creation message that God is our creator. And I know we're here today to talk about the global flood, and there are creationists have different flood models. So I'm really looking forward to talking through specifically the fountains of the Great Deep model called the Hydroplate Theory.
Awesome. Yes, I'm pumped for it too. This is very important. For the audience sake, I want to point out we've got a really good show planned for you guys today, and we're going to make it interactive and engaging. Now, a brief overview of today's show is as follows, guys. We're going to be starting with a quick overview of the hydroplate theory. Then we will be contrasting the hydroplate theory with catastrophic plate tectonics, and also briefly with the vapor canopy model. We will then get into the overwhelming and undeniable scientific and biblical evidence for the Genesis flood, and more specifically for the fountains of the great deep and the hydroplate theory. After this, we are going to provide answers to many of the most common objections to hydroplate theory. We will then be ending with a question and answer period from our faithful listeners. So please tag me with all of your questions pertaining to the topic at hand, of course, the Genesis flood and the hydroplate theory. We'll get to as many as we can, of course, in the time that we have today. Bob, once again, thanks so much. And the floor is yours, Bob.
Wow, what an honor. So the hydroplate theory, it's authored by Dr. Walt Brown, brilliant mechanical engineer, got his PhD from MIT, and he was Army Special Forces. He led in the U.S. here some of our leading military labs. Walt would be the head of above 40 scientists, including quite a few PhDs, as the director of the Benet Research Laboratory. Then the Air Force asked him to transfer forces to go from the Army to the Air Force so he could teach down in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy. So he's obviously highly qualified. He's a brilliant guy. And back in the 70s, late 60s, even 70s, he saw that creationists who were supporting the global flood, because the Bible tells us there was a global flood, that they had a difficulty describing where the water came from. So there was something called the vapor canopy theory, which we could talk about more in a bit, but the creation movement with the scores of PhD scientists around the world, really hundreds of them, the big creation groups, they all supported the vapor canopy theory, but over the years they stopped supporting it because it doesn't work scientifically and the Bible really doesn't say it. For example, the 40 days of rain, if someone were to say that came from a vapor canopy and that's what flooded the earth, well, after the rain stopped, the waters continued to prevail, increase for another 110 days. So what's the source of the water then? Well, the Bible describes first, it says, the fountains of the great deep broke forth. So we propose, those who have studied Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, that the water for the flood came from below the crust in a subterranean chamber that circled the whole earth. And that when the Bible says that the fountains of the great deep broke forth, that this was not any kind of an afterthought on God's part, that he didn't create the earth with a ticking time bomb, but when he created the earth in contingency for the fall and the rebellion against God and the world becoming filled with hatred and violence, God designed the creation of the earth in such a way that there would be fountains of the great deep below the earth's crust, waters reserved for judgment. And the alternatives to the fountains of the great deep model, the hydroplate theory, we argue that they have a very hard time, or actually they cannot explain where the water came from for the global flood. If you reject that the water came from below the crust, then you have an incredibly difficult time explaining to the average creationist where the water came from to cover the mountains and to drown everything on the surface of the earth that breathed air through their nostrils. It didn't drown the fish, obviously, although 90% of all marine organisms, all species, went extinct during the global flood. It's called the Permian extinction. So the hydroplate theory claims that God, and we point to scriptures to substantiate this, that when God created the crust of the earth on day 2, the firmament called the Rakia, he put water below the crust, as we read in Genesis 1, and water above the rakia, the crust, the plate of the Earth's crust. And it was 6 chapters later, when the fountains of the great deep broke forth, the author, Moses, he sort of presumes that people know where the water came from, because it was the fountains of the great deep. And in Genesis 1, we were told that God put a lot of the water above the crust, or the rakia in Hebrew, the firmament, and a lot of the water below. So centuries after the fall in the Garden of Eden, God had kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden. And if you recall, he put cherubim on the east of the garden so that men could not get back in the garden. There were 4 rivers that flowed out of the garden that watered the whole earth, a global irrigation system. Many centuries later, most of 2 millennium later, the fountains of the great deep erupted in such a way, we believe that the crust of the earth originally created at 60 miles thick, and perhaps some couple miles or more of water below that crust around the whole globe. That water erupted with tremendous force. It cracked the Earth's crust. And if that happened, you would expect to see evidence of that crack today. And sure enough, we call it the mid-oceanic ridge. There is, in the Atlantic, it's most well known, the mid-Atlantic ridge. But if you follow that around the globe, it circles the globe like a seam on a baseball. And we believe that that is the aftermath, the wound, if you will, of that original crack. There was no mid-Atlantic ridge or mid-oceanic ridge when the fountains erupted. What happened was the water coming up with tremendous force, the crust cracking, and that crack circled the globe at about 2 miles, a couple miles per second in each direction. It's the speed of sound in granite is how fast that crack expanded. And within a couple hours, the Earth was basically, its entire crust was cracked. Today, you Google it, you look at the mid-oceanic ridge, it's about 40,000 miles long, and it stopped when it ran into itself in the Indian Ocean. So the additional evidence for a global flood, perhaps we could get to later, like you guys mentioned, but that's the basic model, water below the crust. And there's a question of what happened, what triggered the flood. And the primary mechanism is that there's tidal pumping with the moon orbiting the Earth. And as we all know, the tides in the oceans lift up the ocean waters about 8 feet on average around the world. Well, that tide also lifts up the land. And it would have lifted up the land maybe 8 inches today or more, the tides every day, lifting entire continents. And before the flood, the crust of the earth was on water below, so it may have had a bigger impact. It would have. And the physics of it, we could talk about, heated up the water below the crust. And so that those waters below the crust eventually eroded away the ceiling and the floor of that subterranean chamber. And on the day, 1 week after God had Noah and his family go in the ark, the fountains erupted, and then we know many of the consequences of the global flood.
Bob, it's interesting how science continues to confirm the Bible. You mentioned the rakia and the water below the crust. I think there was an article in 2014 in New Scientist where they actually identified massive oceans 3 times greater than what we find on the surface. So there's another scientific fact that confirms what the Bible is saying.
Yes. Now, that study was not an entire body of water. It was the water in rock that they believe over millions of years came to the surface. like geologists believe that diamonds, they say they're 1 to 2 billion years old because of how long they believe it took the diamonds to come to the surface, right? And so they also found water in minerals that they believe came from hundreds of miles below the surface, and the amount of water in those minerals, then they estimate, okay, how much water must be deep below the Earth's surface. But there have been actually a number of studies where they found, for example, a tremendous amount of pooled water under the mountains. And so that's one of the predictions of Walt Brown's theory, that there's pooled salty water under the mountains. And sure enough, and it's been known for a long time, that there is like a gravity hole over the mountains where you'd expect there to be greater gravity because there's more mass. There's actually less gravity. And that's because there is because of the way the mountains were formed, which we could talk about that after the mid-oceanic ridge was being formed. But the water from below the crust pooled under the world's major mountain ranges. And so that water has less mass than granite. And so there's less gravity above our mountain ranges than we would expect.
Well, there goes the idea that evolutionists and uniformitarians like to push that creationists don't make future testable predictions. As a matter of fact, Dr. Walt Brown has made numerous, with many of them being confirmed. Isn't that right, Bob?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm going to our webpage right now, rsr.org/predictions, and we have a list of our own predictions over many years, stunning science predictions that have been confirmed, but also Walt Brown's predictions, and we link to these. And then, of course, his book is online. People could look at the predictions, and they could look at the scientific discoveries that confirm. But I mentioned pooled water under mountains, confirmed. Many whales fossilized at the base of the Andes. Now that's been found, whales in the Andes, but Walt Brown predicts that there are many whales that we will find fossilized at the base of the major mountain ranges. Granite layers deep under the Pacific floor. You guys may have been following all the discoveries, but Zealandia, now that's not too far from you, George, is that right? New Zealand, of course.
Oh, New Zealand, yeah, that's probably about 4 or 5 hour flight, I think, from Australia.
All right, and we've been there to New Zealand. Actually, when our president Bill Clinton went there, 10 of us from our radio show went for a week to protest him while he was in Auckland there. But there is a continent that has been discovered and published. You could just Google it, Zealandia. It's larger than the subcontinent of India. It's 90% submerged, so New Zealand is part of Zealandia, but it fulfills explicitly Walt Brown's prediction that in the Pacific, the crust of the earth sunk, and in the Atlantic, the mantle rose. So as the whole earth cracked from the fountains of the great deep, the water came up with such enormous force that it eroded, of course, the sides of the crack. And the sides of the crack became hundreds of miles wide. And when that happened, you remove all that mass, all that weight above the mantle, and there's something called isostatic rebound. Like if you get a large meteor hits, a meteorite, a crater, if you remove enough rock in this crater basin, the center will begin to bow upward because the whole earth is under tension from its mutual gravity. And if you could picture where the Atlantic Ocean is now and picture thousands of miles long, a swath of the crust of the earth being eroded away, the crack, and then the erosion over a period of 4 months. And beneath that crack where the crust is now eroded away, the mantle was under such pressure that it rose up, isostatic rebound, and coming to within a mile or a few miles of the surface of the earth. And then on the other side of the earth, to compensate, in the Pacific sunk. And the trenches in the Pacific are not from subduction, they're from the consequence of so much mass moving through the earth from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That's how the trenches, the Marianas Trench and the others, were sucked in. And so this is quite a prediction. And John Baumgartner, famous creation scientist, we love him, but he's quite the opponent of Dr. Walt Brown's work and vice versa. Dr. Baumgartner wrote years ago, if Walt Brown's model is correct, there should be a tremendous amount of granite crust submerged below the Pacific. And it turns out now there's not only Zealandia, that's just been published 2 years ago. There are many studies that we have documented and we've linked to ourselves, Walt Brown does in his book, but at our website, rsr.org/HPT. Pretty simple. rsr.org/HPT. You could get the links and find out. We also put this in our Global Flood video of the many swaths of granitic crust that has been found by scientists below the Pacific Ocean. So it's almost as though all scientists work for Walt Brown. Because when Walt is sitting in his study in Phoenix, where we've been with our kids, swim in their pool with Walt and Peggy. They're just as hospitable. They're just as hospitable as could be. Walt's sitting in his study, and he's looking at the Bible, and he understands it's the fountains of the great deep that came up. So he writes that the crust of the earth in the Pacific sunk into the earth. How does he then go out all over the Pacific and get granite and sink it? You know, he can't do that. The reason that his prediction has been confirmed, and it's continually confirmed with more and more discoveries, is that his model is correct. There was water below the crust that broke up during the global flood when the fountains erupted, and that water caused erosion, and most significantly in the Atlantic, where then the mantle rose up. So there are discoveries like, for example, and we link to these also, we make it really easy to discover all this for yourself, to go look and confirm it. But scientists studying the ocean floor in the Atlantic announced this extraordinary discovery. They said there's huge swaths of the Atlantic where the crust is missing. There is no crust. The mantle is exposed. Well, why would that be? It's an explicit confirmation of Walt's model that after the erosion of the crack, the mantle in the Atlantic lifted and the Pacific sunk. And when that happened, guys, that's how the mountain ranges formed in a day, like the Bible says. Because the hydroplate was the Earth's crust, the rakia. Under it was water, and it's supercritical water. 1,300 degrees under tremendous pressure, extremely slippery. Supercritical water, which is used in industry and laboratories, does things that normal liquid water can't do. It's extraordinary what supercritical water does. And the continents now had an imbalance. The Atlantic rose up 60 miles. The Pacific began to sink. And so North and South America literally slid. The hydroplates slid on the water below, the water in the chamber. They slid to the west, toward the Pacific. And when they ran out of water and nowhere to go, they buckled up. Within hours, the Rocky Mountains were raised up within hours. And we see tremendous evidence for that, the rapid forming of the mountains around the world. And Europe, Asia, and Africa, they slid to the east. And so most of the world's mountain ranges run north-south. And we all know the story that Pangea and that North America and South America were once attached to Europe and Africa. And when you look at it, people hear that, kids learn about it first in grade school, and they think, you know, that it looks like it sort of fits on a globe. But thankfully, Walt Brown actually did the work to make a 3D model on a globe. And it turns out Africa, in order to fit, Africa needs to be shrunk by 30%, the area of Africa. And that's actually what the textbooks do. They don't say it, but they shrink Africa dramatically. And they also rotate those continents in different ways. It is not the simple story kids are told, or college students. And so when you look to see what really fits right, it's the continents with the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's the fit. The fountains of the Great Deep broke forth, split the earth all the way around. Today, it's the mid-oceanic ridge. And that crack in the Atlantic, the way it runs, you just get a Google Earth or a globe that shows you the ocean floor, and you see that mid-Atlantic ridge. Up north, it goes through Iceland. And you realize that that does trace the continents.
A couple of things on what you said, Bob. The predictions that Walt Brown's model has done. Surely the predictive power of a model is testament to its accuracy. And the other thing about whale fossils being found on mountain ranges, I mean, I recall watching a YouTube video by, I think the channel's name's Nautilus, where they actually found a whale carcass at the base of the ocean, and they actually noticed that was literally being eaten alive, not alive, being eaten while it was on the floor. But they came back 2 years later, and literally everything, including the bones, were gone. Yeah. So that fossil on the mountains sort of is testament to, hey, there must have been a flood that buried this creature alive pretty quickly, because otherwise you wouldn't find it.
Yeah, that's right. And scientists have done this, almost like controlled studies, where they track how quickly the whale carcass, including the skeleton, disappears, and it is incredibly rapidly. And yet we have whales buried in diatomaceous earth, where they're at an angle, and their diatomaceous earth supposedly is formed over periods of hundreds of thousands of years, and yet this whale skeleton is still three-dimensional, and it's covered in diatoms. So obviously that all happened very rapidly.
Well, I'd like to say that testable predictions are the gold standard of science. And these confirmed predictions that you're talking about, Bob, demonstrate the validity of the flood model that Dr. Brown is proposing. Mm-hmm. So my question is, out of curiosity, how do the critics respond? Well, are they saying it's just a coincidence, or?
Yeah. And when we talk about the critics, it's not only the secular evolutionary critics, but there's a lot of creationist critics. And on Real Science Radio, we've, I think, it seems to me, we have a wonderful relationship with all the big creation groups and their scientists. We've done so many interviews beginning 30 years ago with Ken Ham in studio. And so all these years, but there is a tremendous disagreement between the big groups like AIG and ICR and CMI in their flood model, the creation catastrophic plate tectonics, with Walt's theory, the fountains of the Great Deep. Could I mention a couple more predictions first, and then
Of
we'll talk
course.
about how they're handled.
Of course. Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
So Walt has predicted in writing, since confirmed, things like, carbon-14 in old fossils, salt on Mars, water inside large asteroids, that asteroids are low density flying rock piles that are barely held together by ice, water ice. Specifically, that rocks on asteroids and comets are rounded. That's an incredible prediction. And I wonder, I think I have a photo here. I do. I wonder if I could share my screen for you guys to look at this close picture of Comet 67P. So what do I do here? I just click share screen.
That's right. Yep. And then I can approve it once I see it show up on screen.
Okay.
Yep, there it is. Let me add to the stream, Bob, and there we go. I'll make it full screen so the audience can see better.
Okay. All right. So the little sign there, Walt Brown was here, that actually wasn't in the original picture.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. But we did add that picture because when you look at, and I realize we're bouncing around here, if that's okay. I don't know how informal we could be, but this here is a photo. The European Space Agency landed on Comet 67P, and it's extraordinary what they accomplished. And if you could see in this picture, maybe better than the first one, there you can see hundreds, and there are obviously hundreds of thousands or millions of rounded boulders that make up this comet. And if you get a rounded boulder, you need rock to be tumbled in a high energy flow to get boulders like the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, or 6 feet in diameter, 10 feet in diameter. And Walt predicted this. It's just like him predicting the granite, huge swaths of granite. I mean, one chunk bigger than India, beneath the Pacific Ocean, which plate tectonics leaders, including creationist John Baumgartner, would say is impossible. They know there is no granite below the Pacific. It violates their model of plate tectonics. And then, lo and behold, it's overwhelmingly obvious and continually being discovered granitic crust below the Pacific. Now you go out to space, and here are rounded boulders in comets. And so in my brief description of what happened in the hydroplate theory, we talked about water coming up from below the crust, 60 miles below the crust. So imagine the force, the energy. Think about, let's say there was water below North America, and the crust was cracked so that the water could escape to the earth. And you think the entire mass of North America is pressing down on this water. That water is going to reach a very high, it's going to accelerate to a tremendous velocity. Now, if we continue to talk about Walt's model, it's not only the weight of the crust on the subterranean chamber, but there's a very significant additional energy source that accelerated that water up through the crack at such a rate. And remember all the erosion of the sides of the crack eroding, and enormous rocks, chunks of the crust breaking off, and they're rolling up 60 miles, these rocks. Many of them are getting rounded, and that water, with the debris of the flood, much of it reached escape velocity, 7 miles per second and more, and literally left Earth's gravity. And that's how the moon got beat up. How did the moon get beat up in a young Earth? As a Christian, guys, I became a Christian in 1973, a radical conversion. I grew up as a Roman Catholic altar boy, 8 years Catholic grammar school. and freshman in high school, I become a Christian. I start studying the Bible intensely. I'm convinced that God made the earth in the recent past. Evolution is not true. And I would look up at the moon and I would ask my Christian friends, how did the moon get beat up? We believe that God made everything perfect, the earth and the solar system, the heavens, it was all perfect. And the moon, its composition, it's like a mirror, and it reflects the light of the sun onto the earth, day and night, but especially at night. We see it, it's beautiful, but it's no longer beautiful. Now it's all beat up. And then once we developed telescopes, we're able to see that the other rocky planets are all beat up. And the solar system is dangerous. It's now a dangerous place. There are these errant bullets that are flying through the solar system, and quite a few of them hit the Earth. And so, like we have in Russia some decades ago, closer to 100 years ago, a huge swath of a forest destroyed by an impact. So these are dangerous, errant bullets flying around through space. Many of them have collected because they were ejected from the fountains at the same trajectory, at the same speed, with a tremendous amount of water and dust and rock. And as that debris accelerated through space, as it went out and it got further and further from the Earth's gravity became less of an influence, and the mutual mass of the rocks and the debris and the water caused those jets to combine into what we see today, the asteroids and the comets, even what are called the TNOs, the trans-Neptunian objects, and then the meteors. All that debris, all that trash, if you will, that's messed up the solar system, the heavens, that is a result of man's sin. And so when God created the earth, the source of the water for a global judgment was not an afterthought. He created the earth with the waters below the crust reserved for judgment, for a contingency if man sinned and the earth became filled with violence. And so when we look at the moon, we now know why it's beat up. And in fact, the near side of the moon is beat to a pulp. That's where most of the dark Maria are, like the man on the moon, his eyes, his mouth, and all. And on the far side of the moon, that's sprinkled. There's a dramatic difference between the near side and the far side. The near side is pummeled, and it has far more mass. There are these mass differences between the near side and the far side. And so one side of the moon got pummeled and the other got sprinkled. So
while you're on the moon, a recent article that I read from NASA, actually it was in September this year, they actually found hematite, a common iron oxide, which is commonly known as rust, on the lunar surface. Now, the question is how is that possible without oxygen and liquid water?
Wow. There is so much going on the moon. Sorry, I'm typing while you're telling us this great stuff. But the TESS, the transient events of the solar system, there is so much going on in the entire solar system that's not supposed to be happening if it were billions of years old. But if we, like Mercury's rapid decline of its magnetic field, same thing with Earth, very rapid, shocking, in fact. But when we look at the moon, the Earth's moon, they're called TLPs, transient lunar phenomenon. There are over 2,000 moonquakes per year on the moon, the strongest magnitude 5.5. The moon has unexpected heat being released. It is shrinking, rapid measured dust buildup, yet minimal global accumulation of dust. Molten outer core on the moon. These are all, we have links to all the studies, most of this from NASA and astrophysicists. Volcanism, many young craters. None of this is creationist discoveries. These are all discoveries that contradict their claim that the moon is billions of years old. Ubiquitous micrometeorites, where they should all have been covered up over billions of years of dust, and boulder tracks, radon and helium emissions. The moon is receding. There's dust clouds between the Earth and the moon. They're huge, yet they're temporary. Why are they there right now? So the moon, while the secular world claimed for decades it was geologically inactive, it turns out that there's so much going on the moon that indicates that the moon's surface was destroyed, was corrupted in the recent past, not millions or billions of years ago.
Bob, you'll be interested to know that Professor David McQueen, whom we've had, I think, on 3 previous occasions.
Yes, I know David. I've spoke to him. Neat guy.
Yeah. One of the topics that we intend to cover is the geology of the moon, probably in the next month or so.
That's
so
awesome.
you may want to tune in and hear what he has to say about that.
Well, we will sure do that. And I don't know if you recall, but the moon has given a tremendous difficulty to our friends who are the authors of the catastrophic plate tectonics theory. And perhaps we could get, I'm sure we will get into that, but you asked, how are these predictions handled? And the predictions, they go on and on. There are so many extraordinary predictions that Walt Brown makes. And if you look at catastrophic plate tectonics, the predictions that the creationist model makes, I think, are right around 0. And so when creationists look at Walt Brown's predictions, John Baumgartner, I've spoken to him on a couple issues. I'll give you another example. Walt's model explains why the Earth's crust is loaded with radioactivity. When God created the Earth, there should be no uranium, no thorium, no radon, all this radioactivity that causes birth defects, even fatal, lethal birth defects. That would have not been a part of God's perfect creation. So where did all the radioactivity come from? Well, Walt's model, it doesn't have to be stretched or exaggerated. It's the most extraordinary natural outcome of Walt's model, where the radioactivity came from. And we do need to talk about that as we continue. But the basic idea is as the Atlantic rose and the Pacific sunk, creating an imbalance, so North and South America slide to the west, and they slide rapidly, not an inch per year, but 60 miles an hour, continents moving. And then they stopped, and that tremendous inertia caused the mountains to rise up, so that the continents were thickened and buckled. And when you compress granite is, I think it's something like 25% quartz by volume. When you compress granite, the quartz is piezoelectric. That means it produces electricity. So Walt's model points out that so much electricity was produced during the tectonic activity of the global flood that it literally squeezed the nuclei of atoms together and created all of the Earth's dangerous radioactivity, everything that's in the crust of the Earth. So Dr. Baumgartner, we talked at length about this, and he said, Bob, there can be no electrical field generated from granite. It can't happen by physics. So I say, Dr. Baumgartner, that I understand that thought, but you know that it's been extensively, and I'm going here to answers, it's been extensively documented that earthquakes produce a tremendous amount In fact, they're called earthquake lights around the world. That earthquakes produce electricity. I'm looking for in our list here. Let's see. Okay, National Geographic 2013. That's not a science journal, but they refer to the science journals. An earthquake producing 1 million amps. Million amps. USGS in 2010, in the Earthquakes and Electricity section of Origin of Earth's Radioactivity, Walt references extensive observation of earthquakes generating electrical currents from the New Madrid earthquake, as reported by USGS. And so we have what, 7 different reports, including I interviewed an executive at Quake Finder. They're an organization here in Denver, and they monitor electromagnetic emissions in order to predict earthquakes in California, Peru, Taiwan, and Greece. We're talking about a project that costs tens of millions of dollars. The discoveries go on, even to the point where laboratory tests, where they have compressed huge blocks of granite and they measure the voltage that comes off of those blocks, those boulders.
Bob, just to give some perspective on the million amps, a general household switch is around 20 amps. So you can see how large that earthquake amperage is.
That million amps, and if you realize that earthquake was insignificant compared to the forces unleashed during the global flood.
Yeah.
Absolutely insignificant. And so talking to Dr. Baumgartner, and he could respond to this. We've asked him to respond in writing and to acknowledge with the increasing number of, documented discoveries of earthquake lights and earthquakes producing, and we know exactly how they produce this tremendous amperage. We've asked him to retract his argument that he's also put in writing that Walt is wrong because granite cannot produce electricity. And so what we've noticed is often, a refusal to have give and take and to say, okay, here, this criticism I launched at the Hydroplate Theory, I have to retract that. In fact, we have a place where we have 2 places on our website where we look for retractions. We have lists where we're waiting for retractions. On our CPT page, which is rather stunning, Catastrophic Plate Tectonics, they have published 5 miracles, and we have them all listed here. 5 miracles not described in the Bible that are required for catastrophic plate tectonics to work. And I'd love to share some of these with you guys, but let me ask a question. I think you guys are far more knowledgeable than most about the issues that creationists discuss, than the average person who supports CMI or the Creation Museum or the Ark and so on. Do you guys think the creationists who believe in catastrophic plate tectonics, do you think those average creationists could explain where the water came from for the global flood?
Well, I could, but I'm not sure about the average creationist.
Okay, it's my experience that the vast majority of creationists cannot explain where the water came from.
Well, I was going to say, based on what you said earlier in the presentation, Bob, if we reject the water of the fountains of the great deep, then
Right.
we are essentially going to have a very difficult time explaining where all the water has come from.
Yes. So here's what CMI and AIG and others have done. When they do articles or mention the fountains of the Great Deep, it's rather subtle, but they're no longer water. The fountains of the Great Deep are not water. They claim that the fountains of the Great Deep are magma. I don't know, is that statement, is that familiar to you guys? That it's
Yes.
no longer believed that the fountains of the Great Deep are water, but now it's believed it's magma.
Yes, I think that's the biggest difference between the CPT and the HPT models. One says water and the other one says magma.
Yeah, so
Right.
here we have a video of going through the Creation Museum, which we love. I spent a day at the Creation Museum with Ken Ham, two leading creationists here in Colorado, private guys, but Joe Coors of the Coors family, the brewery, and a racetrack owner, John Bandemere. They chartered a private Frontier airline jet, and we flew to the Creation Museum, spent the day, and came back. And so it was a great time. We love those guys. But in the Creation Museum, let me show you their video here. That's magma coming up from the mantle. And that magma coming up from the mantle is what we're told. Here, maybe I could get a better clip of it here. I could even put the audio on, I think.
So does this mean like the fountains of magma of the Great Deep?
So that's amazing. It's a neat animation, but they're showing magma coming from the core of the earth, not water. This is a magma-looking volcanic.
Okay, so magma, for what's published on the physics of magma, and we've done a series on hotspots and all, there's something called the crossover depth, a couple hundred miles below the surface, where when rock melts, it becomes dense. It doubles in its density and it sinks. It can't rise when it's denser than the mantle rock around it. So we believe, and many leading secular geologists have come out strongly against these ideas that magma is coming up through the mantle. But aside from the fact that we believe it's physically impossible, let's say it did happen and magma came up and it went under the pre-existing sea, it's claimed that that's going to cause supersonic jets. So supersonic jets from magma coming up. Here's a video I've got, I think. Oh, where's the video? In Hawaii, 2 summers ago, we did a whole series of programs. I don't know how I find the video real quickly, but of the magma that was flowing into the Pacific. If you guys remember, one eruption lasted for like 6 weeks. Yeah, and I'll turn off the audio. But so whether you have magma coming up from below the sea or flowing into the sea, you're not going to have supersonic jets rising to the top of the atmosphere. There's a moron guy swimming here. Now he's crazy. He's lucky he didn't die.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're not going to have supersonic jets rising up with the torrential rain that the Bible describes for 40 days. And where do you get the water? So catastrophic plate tectonics claims essentially, that we had a global flood. Don't add water. You don't need water. Now, magma has, little percentages of water in lava and in magma, but they claim that the global flood happened when magma rose up and it flooded the base of the surface water basins, so that the surface water gradually rose up, and then it sloshed in a series of massive tidal waves. It sloshed up over the continents, and that's the global flood. Except that that's nothing like what the Bible says. The fountains of the great deep, it's not reasonable to do a switch on creationists and make them buy into a model, and then after they've been supporting the model for a year or 2 or 10 years, then they realized there were no water fountains. The fountains of the great deep were magma, and no water was added to flood the continent, to flood the earth, and even above the highest mountains. So we think that when you claim that the water for the flood did not come from below the crust, that you have no explanation, no reasonable explanation for where the water came from.
Well, what I would have to say is I find it amazing, based on everything you said, Bob, that the fountains of the great deep and the water under the crust, like we're talking about, these are supported by both science and from scripture.
Yeah, absolutely. Continually, they find crushed granite, the deepest holes ever drilled. They find crushed granite in salt water. And that's not supposed to be. These were shocking discoveries for creationists. Let me share with you something else. You see this image of sedimentary rock at the Grand Canyon? If I shrink my window, does that help it get bigger? The graphic, maybe it does.
I can see it.
All right. So if you think about, where did all those sediments come from? Where did they come from? The vapor canopy theory has no conceivable way of eroding a mile thick of sediments that cover the continents of the world on average. The raindrops could have came down with jet engines on them, and they're not going to erode that much rock. So the authors, the promoters of catastrophic plate tectonics, they have admitted dramatically that their model has a huge difficulty in explaining where the sediments came from. Now, think about this. If you've eroded so much during the early weeks of the flood, you've eroded, let's say, 1/4 of a mile of sediments that are covering the continents. How are you going to erode more rock? You can't get below those sediments. Those sediments are now protecting the crust of the earth below them. You can only hold so much sediment in suspension as the flood waters are over the face of the earth. Those sediments are falling out of suspension rapidly, and they're building up. We didn't get just a mile of sediments all on the last day of the flood. You know, these happened over the weeks and months of the flood. So once you erode 1/2 mile of sediments, so that now the continents are totally covered, where do you erode the next 50% of all the world's sediments, maybe 200 million cubic miles of sediments? You've got 100 million already laid down on the continents. Where does the rest come from? Well, just like CPT does not have a good answer for where the water came from, they have a massive problem to explain where did the sediments come from. And this was the answer given in 2013. I had the honor of going to the International Conference on Creationism. And by the way, guys, my YouTube chat with evolutionist Jack Horner, where we offered him $23,000 to carbon date his soft tissue T-Rex. That video was played at the 7th ICC. This was in Pittsburgh.
Oh,
and there, awesome. Yeah, it was really a great time. I don't know, have you guys seen that video?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I have.
Yeah, so much fun. Because we know there's carbon-14 in all these dinosaur bones, just like there's carbon-14 in diamonds. They can't be 1 billion years old, 2 billion years old. They
That's
didn't
right.
they didn't come up from that deep below the crust in order to get the pressure necessary to turn carbon into diamonds. The diamonds were formed during the compression event where the continents slid and then came to a screeching halt as they thickened and buckled. That is so much pressure. That's what created the diamonds. So they think, oh, these rocks, these minerals, it took billions of years to come up from deep in the earth because that's where they think is the only place to get that pressure. Of course, that's false.
That's a great point.
Well, thank you. And I should have made it earlier when we were talking about diamonds. But so here, this is an animation of the Earth with our moon in the background there, and the moon's orbit around the Earth. And in the foreground, this is a second moon that was proposed by Dr. John Baumgartner. He delivered a paper. I was there. We quote from it. We got recordings in our own flood video. And he said, here's what happened. Here's how the catastrophic plate tectonic model can explain where the Earth's sediments came from. Because if the water is rising up in the surface basins, and that water is lapping up onto the continents, ferociously lapping up in 6 huge tidal wave sessions, you can't erode enough sediments to cover the continents. And they know that. They absolutely know that. So Dr. Baumgartner proposed that the Earth, I'm thinking whether I should click on his paper or not, that a second moon appeared and it orbited the Earth. I'm going to turn off the audio because it's not important. But I think we got an animation here. Where's our animation going? The second moon orbited the Earth 6 times, and the gravity from the second moon was sufficient to cause the floodwaters to become so turbulent that eroded the water of the sediments. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that is dead on arrival. There is no reasonable proposal in order to solve a model problem of where did the sediments come from, that a second moon appeared. That's not reasonable. We call that miracle number 4, because catastrophic plate tectonics relies on a series of miracles that the hydroplate theory does not. So, by the way, after 6 orbits, Dr. Baumgartner said something, we don't know what, pulled the secondary moon out of Earth's orbit, and it's now gone. And so the point of this is not to show what a bad idea this is. The point of it is to show the huge problem that CPT has in explaining where the sediments came from. So not only could they not explain where the water came from, they can't explain where the sediments came from. So 3 years later, Dr. Baumgartner revised this. He didn't retract it. He said he was revising it. He should have said he was retracting it. But what he put in its place is also completely unable to explain where the sediments came from and then how they were distributed. If we were to ask the typical, again, with my questions, right? The typical creationist who loves, ICR, loves CMI. You guys have interviewed so many of our favorites, Rob Carter, Jonathan Sarfati, Kevin Anderson, and so many. I mean, these guys, they're extraordinary human beings and scientists, but their groups support not plate tectonics, catastrophic plate tectonics, just like to us, It's the same thing as theistic evolution. Christians who were trying to figure out how do you put the secular science into the Bible, they took evolution and they made it theistic evolution. Well, we believe Dr. Baumgartner, who got his PhD, a secular geologist, and he says he had an epiphany. We quote him. He said this, in fact, at this ICC meeting. He said he had an epiphany. Let's put plate tectonics into Genesis and see how it works. And so we think that was the same dead end, the same mistake of putting evolution into the Bible. You just Christianize evolution and you've got a catastrophe. So you take plate tectonics, where all the evidence is against plate tectonics, just like all the evidence is against evolution, and you put plate tectonics and you call it theistic plate tectonics or catastrophic plate tectonics because you speed it up 1,000,000-fold. And you're now going down the same dead end where you're not going to make predictions, you're not going to understand, and you're going to give creationists and Christians a very weak foundation on which they could explain where did the water come from, where did the water go, where did the sediments come from. So I just asked the question, the average Christian, the average experienced creationist who agrees that CPT must be right because all the big groups support it. If you were to ask them, how did it start? How did CPT start? Right? Well, the Bible says that the flood started with the breaking forth of the fountains of the great deep. CPT says that the physical laws were somehow altered by God to cause the events of the flood to unfold. So that's our CPT miracle number one. And if you're going to change the physical laws supernaturally, then you might as well not have a scientific model because you can't test it, because every problem is solved by a miracle. So CPT miracle number two, this is how the flood itself then actually began. The edges of the supercontinent, Pangaea or whatever they want to call it, the edges of the continent got colder by 720 degrees. And by getting colder, they sunk into the mantle. And that's what got catastrophic plate tectonics going. Now, that's the claim that a miracle happened, but it's not a miracle as described in the Bible. It's what another geologist, a neat friend of mine, Phil Budd, here in Denver, he's a creationist, PhD, maybe a master's. Phil Budd calls these miracles of convenience. Whenever your model has a problem, say that there was a miracle and that solves it. So how does a creationist start CPT? Well, the edges of the supercontinent got 700 degrees colder, and therefore they got denser and they began to sink into the warmer mantle. Now, I suggest that not even 5% of all the creationists who believe in CPT have any idea what they believe in. They have no idea, that they have a hard time explaining where the water came from, that they don't know that this happened. And then miracle number three, maybe it's part of number two, I don't know. The Earth's mantle got mushier or it got firmer, right? We link to all the papers published by CPT's lead authored. We're not making any of this stuff up. It's as accurate as could be. And here's Dr. Baumgartner saying the mantle's viscosity at the time of the flood was lower than that at present to permit rapid sinking of the lithosphere into the mantle. So the mantle either had to get softer, or since the flood, it got firmer, one or the other, but that's another miracle. Miracle number four, God brought a second moon to erode Earth's sediments. And this is quoting directly from Dr. Baumgartner. 6 near encounters with a moon-sized body temporarily captured by the Earth can plausibly account for Earth's sediments. Now, guys, you know how when school kids are taught evolution, and it's so simple. Look at the butterflies; they were light, and now they're dark, or whatever. And it's presented in such a simple way, and so they end up believing it. Well, the same thing has happened to the creation movement. The hundreds of thousands of creationists who support the movement, they believe because they trust our creation scientists. It's not plate tectonics. Okay, it's theistic or catastrophic plate tectonics, but they have no idea what they bought into, just like people believe in the Big Bang. They have no idea what they're buying into. So miracle claim number 5, and this is just stunning, that God supernaturally accelerated nuclear decay, as described in the RAPE project. So all creationists, young earth creationists, we recognize there's way more evidence of radioactive decay in the crust of the earth than could be explained in 7,000 years at today's rates of radioactive decay. We all recognize that. The difference between the hydroplate theory, which explains the origin of Earth's radioactivity, and CPT, is they need a miracle. So the miracle is that God supernaturally accelerated nuclear decay. That's a miracle of convenience. That's not explained in the Bible. The Bible says God judged the earth with a flood, not with accelerated nuclear decay. And even if God wanted to supernaturally put uranium throughout the earth's crust, why does he have to make it decay at such an accelerated rate? Then miracle number 6, all that supernatural accelerated decay would melt the earth. Talk about a heat problem. The CPT has a massive heat problem, and it really is unreasonable for them to offer the objection that Walt Brown's model has a heat problem. That's not cool. What they should say is our model has a serious heat problem, but so does Walt. But we think we solve the heat problem by God supernaturally removing the heat, right? And this is, and I think you guys can see on the screen, radioisotopes and the agents, the rape log. Thank you. Volume 2, the heat problem. God was directly involved in all of these events, so it is possible that he employed some supernatural process which does not occur today or cannot be detected. And guys, if you look and see what they proposed, one of their proposals is that God expanded the size of the universe 20-fold in order to remove the heat. And where'd the heat come from? Why do you have to do that? Well, because he supernaturally accelerated nuclear decay. Well, where does the Bible say God did that? And he made the universe 20 times bigger to get rid of the heat? We think these are exactly as unreasonable as the claims made by the secular origins, Big Bang, and evolutionist. We think there's an exact model because the concept was bad from the beginning. You don't take the secular origins model and put it into Genesis. If you do that, then you're going to spend decades of increasingly unreasonable secondary assumptions. And then there comes what we call the anti-miracle, when John Baumgartner, and I know I'm criticizing him, but I truly love him as a brother, and I'm so thankful for all the people he's brought to the Lord by standing tall for the scriptures and creation. And I have honored him in dozens of programs that we've done, whether he's been on the show or not, the materials he's produced, promoting them. So there is a love, but there's a tremendous disagreement. So John Baumgartner and his associate, brilliant engineer, brilliant beyond measure, Dr. Mark Horstemeyer, they stood up, they did a plenary talk at the ICC in Pittsburgh in 2013. And here's what they said. They said the the rocks brought back from the moon are just as real as the moon itself. They're just as real as the Earth. And because the lunar rocks have the radioactivity they do, we know that the moon was created before day 4. That stunned the entire hundreds of creationists, many scientists who were there. It stunned everyone. And thankfully, Danny Faulkner, who was the moderator, he stood up and he rebuked Dr. Baumgartner in front of the whole group. He rebuked him. Because if we young Earth creationists are going to say the moon was created before day 4, just like the day agers say, just like Reasons to Believe says, then we are no longer being true to our commitment to the text. And here's what's even worse about their claim. And I don't know that they ever retracted this claim. They will both tell you that they don't know why there's accelerated decay. They don't know how the accelerated decay happened. But they do know there's evidence of accelerated decay. So when you don't know why it's there and you don't know how it happened, why take that extreme lack of knowledge and use it to undermine confidence in the Genesis account? If anything, admit your confusion, but don't make an assertion that the moon had to be created before day 4. So we are waiting for retractions. I hope this is not rude to do this, but we're waiting for these miracle claims to be retracted. And only miracle 4, with the second moon appearing, if you click on that link, you could read Dr. Baumgartner's paper from 2016, and he should say it's a retraction, but he doesn't. He says it's a revision. In his revision, it eliminates the second moon, but it replaces it with a proposal that's equally incapable of explaining all the sediments on the Earth's surface. And if his secondary proposal was plausible, he would have never proposed a secondary moon. Never. Because this is like an obvious claim. Oh, the tectonic activity during the flood was enough to create the sediments. No, it wasn't. And where did the sediments come from? Once the continents were blanketed, once the continents had 3/4 of a mile of sediment laid down, where did the next 1/4 of a mile of sediments come from? So, guys, I don't know to what extent you support, one flood model or another, but let me ask a question. Maybe you guys could answer this question for me. In Walt's flood model of the fountains of the Great Deep, where the water comes from 60 miles below the surface, does that model give an indication of where the sediments may come from to blanket the continents?
Well, since
Yes.
it's limestone, for sure, because it's made chemically in that model.
Yes. And think about the mudstone and think about the sandstone. And all the sedimentary rocks on the surface of the Earth, they were eroded away from the crust of the Earth and from the subterranean chamber, from the ceiling and the floor. They were eroded away as the fountains rose with tremendous force to the surface. So Walt's model, the fountains of the Great Deep, it explicitly tells us where the sediments came from. The floodwaters brought the sediments to the surface.
I can agree with that. Bob, two things. If I can go back to the magma rising from the sea, from below the oceans.
Yeah.
Are you aware of this island called Surtsey?
Yeah. We make a big deal about Surtsey. We love Surtsey.
Yeah, well, Surtsey, as you know, was formed within 10 years, and I think it was about 2.7 or 3 square kilometers in size. But
Yeah.
Within 50 years, 50% of it has eroded. So that's another point
Wow.
that
Wow.
contradicts the millions and billions of years.
Yeah, what a great point. And the fun thing about Surtsey, we have it here on our list of not so old things. When you read the chief geologist of Iceland, Sigurdur Þórinsson, I don't know if you guys pronounce it better than I could. He said that the time scale that he had been trained to attach to geological developments is misleading. For what is said to take thousands of years, the same development may take in a few weeks or even days to form a landscape so varied and mature that it was almost beyond belief. Wide sandy beaches, precipitous crags, gravel banks and lagoons, impressive cliffs, hollows, glens, and soft undulating land, fractures and fault scarps, channels and screes, confounded by what met your eye, boulders worn by the surf, some of which were almost round. That's all. Yeah.
The interesting part, Bob, the reason why I brought that up is there's no report of jets of steam, because this thing literally came out of the ocean and was built by volcanic magma.
Right. So if if CPT was right and magma came up from the molten outer crust, right? Now the outer crust, we assert and we think we could demonstrate, was not molten when God made the earth. But if that were true, you're not going to have supersonic jets to the upper atmosphere causing torrential rain. And thank you for bringing up Surtsey. What a great point.
Yeah, the other point I wanted to make was regarding the accelerated nuclear decay. The fact that we find radio halos proves that there was no heat problem, number one, and second, it sort of adds to the validity of the Z-pinch experiments, where we see the heavy elements produced with parent-to-daughter ratios similar to those we find on Earth, which suggests that decay, that initial decay, as you know, it's adiabatic, and there was no heat problem.
All right, now there's a word, adiabatic. Let me look that up and see what that means. No, I don't know about the audience, but when I first studied this, I had to look up adiabatic, and it's when heat doesn't enter or leave a system or a reaction, it doesn't produce heat. And sure enough, Walt Brown's model does the most brilliant job explaining the origin of Earth's radioactivity. When I had a famous atheist astrophysicist on the show, he's a cosmologist, his name is Dr. Lawrence Krauss from ASU. I attended ASU years ago. I went on to work at McDonnell Douglas Helicopter Company and Hughes Helicopters on the Apache attack helicopter for the Army. But Dr. Krauss disagreed. He was so disagreeable on our 40-minute interview, but there was one thing he agreed with. When I said that 90% of Earth's radioactivity is in the crust of the Earth, he said that is absolutely true. And then I added that it's in the continental crust, and he agreed with that. And further, it's preferentially near granite. That's where Earth's radioactivity is overwhelmingly. It's not in the crust. It's not in the mantle. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It's not in the core. It's not in the mantle. It's in the crust. And why is uranium preferably near granite? It's because granite has quartz, a tremendous amount of quartz. And when that granite was compressed during the compression event of the global flood, when the mountains rose up, and other times in the previous 40 days, but when that granite was compressed, it created so much such powerful electricity. It's the piezoelectric effect creates this electricity, and then there's something that's been tested around the world in labs, Z-pinch, where electrical currents will take the nuclei of atoms and squeeze them together. And so there have been so many studies. Well, the main one over in the Ukraine by, I think I heard one of you guys mention Dr. Adamenko in his Proton 21 lab. They did hundreds of experiments where they Z-pinched the most common minerals and elements on the crust of the earth, and it created, in like a millionth of a second, it created all of the elements in the periodic table, right up to uranium, and I believe even beyond uranium. And so that explains to us why Earth's radioactivity is near granite, because the radioactivity was produced during the unfathomable tectonic activity of the global flood.
Bob, did you notice the answer Lawrence Krauss gave? He literally hand waved it away and called it an anomaly.
Yes, an anomaly. Think about what he believes, right? He believes that uranium and the different isotopes of uranium, the ratio of the two is extraordinarily precise. Uranium-235 and 238, the standard deviation is so tiny, less than one uranium-235 atom for every 100 238 atoms, even though they have very different half-lives. And uranium is found all over the world, and almost wherever you find it, it has this precise ratio of 100 to 1. So if those uranium isotopes were created in supernova, or when black hole collided with a neutron star or whatever, that's now how they say these elements were made. Then why would it be that billions of years later, after swirling around in nebula out in space, and then ending up on a molten Earth, why would we find them in this extraordinary precise ratio all over the world? Why would that be?
Yeah, and if it was a molten ball of rock, you'd expect them to have sunk deep into the mantle.
Exactly, because uranium is so dense. Like gold, uranium is denser than gold, and it should have sunk deep into the earth. Lawrence Krauss, he's a physicist. He should do better than a Bible-thumping pastor and talk show host. But he said, well, uranium floated because it's a large atom. Well, it's not the size. If you have a really big 8-cylinder V8 engine and you throw it into the ocean, it's not going to float because it's big. It's the density that causes something to float or sink. And uranium is one of the most dense elements, if you exclude atheists.
Not to mention that there wouldn't be granite to begin with, because if it was a molten planet, it would all be rhyolite.
Yes, you can't. They cannot explain granite, just like they can't explain the moon, and they can't explain how stars form, and they can't explain how life originates. They can't explain the dust in the galaxies. They also can't explain granite. Granite, all things.
In addition to that, Bob, granite is made up, I think, of about 4 minerals, and each one of those minerals has a specific density.
Yes.
And if it was molten, you'd expect those minerals to have effectively gradated in those densities.
Yes, exactly. Guys, you see this headline, 2017 Science headlines: lightning bolts create radioactivity, scientists discover. Well, we're cracking up, right? We put Walt Brown was here on this. We put Walt Brown was here on tons of science.
I love it.
Discoveries. because all scientists work for Walt Brown. All of Walt's supporters knew all along that lightning, electricity creates radioactivity.
Now, Bob, can I just take you sort of a little bit off track a little bit, but it's still to do with the heat problem.
Sure.
I've heard of, and I think most atheists and evolutionists think of a solution to the heat problem based on just one specific characteristic, but I've heard of boundary conditions.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And most people aren't aware that it's not just one particular factor that's involved in dissipating heat, but there's a number of other ways that the heat could have dissipated and not been a problem.
Well, could we, you guys, I know I've heard you talk about engineer Brian Nickel, aerospace engineer. Could we ask him, now you're getting a little bit more into his domain. I'm a talk show host and a pastor. And
Brian, come on, Bob. Come on, Bob.
I need a life. No, really, guys, I need a lifeline here.
We welcome Brian Nichols.
Well, I just, if it's okay, I just forwarded to him the link you guys gave me to StreamYard so to join this interview. And I did ask him last night, I said, Brian, if I get stuck, will you be available to help me? And he said he'll be at work, but if he possibly could, he'll join in. So the link you gave me, would it work for him if he clicks on it?
Yes, definitely. Yep. And you guys are such a blessing to us. So of course, if he wants to join and
wow,
add to the discussion, it'd be an honor. Amen.
Well, that's really nice of you guys, and to be so informal, I appreciate that. So while we're seeing if Brian could call in, mentioning I'm the pastor of Denver Bible Church. Guys, I'd like to break some news on your show. We haven't said this on my show yet. It's not hit the news yet. But Denver Bible Church, we have sued the federal government and the state of Colorado for the COVID restrictions they put on our church. And our federal judge, Daniel Domenico, ruled 44-page ruling in our favor. He said, we will prevail on the merits. So he said, members of Denver Bible Church do not have to wear masks, and they don't have to have this arbitrary limit of 50 people in their church. So it's stunning, you know? So the state of Colorado appealed immediately to our 10th Circuit, and the 10th Circuit put a very gentle stay. And they said, well, let's see what develops in Domenico's courtroom. So we have oral arguments scheduled for a week from today. And we just heard from the Attorney General's office in the state of Colorado, 4 attorneys. They called our lead attorney, Rebecca Messel, and they said, Rebecca, you're going to like this news. We're going to concede. We're going to drop our resistance, and you guys won this round.
Wow, you've heard it first on the SFT channel.
Amen. That's awesome.
That's right, awesome. SFT.
Beautiful.
And the reason it appears that they decided to fold their cards is because there was a victory really by an action at the U.S. Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago where churches in Brooklyn, they got a reprieve from Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo's draconian restrictions. They basically won that at the Supreme Court, even though the whole court didn't hear the case, they won it. And their filing with the U.S. Supreme Court, it cited our Denver Bible Church lawsuit 6 times. And so when our Attorney General saw the writing on the wall that the Supreme Court, at least, you know, all this indication agrees with us, they rather drop the case and let us have a victory now than perhaps we get a victory against them at the U.S. Supreme Court. They didn't want that to happen.
Amen. Well, you heard it here first. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, super.
And looks like Brian Nickel Brian, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. We love the work that you've done. We've learned so much from you. So thanks for being here, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Brian, they asked me a question that I didn't feel qualified to answer. So maybe I think it was George
Yes.
Bond.
Yes,
George
yes.
Bond. Could you put that question to Brian?
Definitely. Hi, Brian. I've had a short discussion with you on Messenger at Facebook.
Yeah.
I believe you're working on the 9th edition at the moment, and I'm very eager to see those calculations for the heat problem because I'm a retired civil engineer, so I understand a little bit about mathematics. So I'll be eager to have a look at those. But the question that I posed to Bob actually wasn't a question, but it was more about addressing the heat problem, and I'd stated that there's really not one factor that can explain the criticisms towards creationists in this area, but I mentioned boundary conditions, and I'm sure you can expand a bit on boundary conditions and how they actually can be used to solve the heat problem.
Yeah, well, I think it can be used to understand it a little bit better, and to identify where I think a lot of the criticisms of hydroplate theory go wrong. So I won't say that we can just easily or easily solve the heat problem for hydroplate theory, if you want to call it a heat problem, in terms of having some summation of numbers that just gives us an absolute, oh, this is solved, right? But I think where a lot of the criticisms go wrong is they tend to oversimplify hydroplate to the point that they so that they can analyze it, but then they leave out a whole lot of physics that's happening in the hydroplate scenario. And so I think what you're referring to is boundary conditions in terms of like boundary layers in a high-speed flow, things like that. Is that?
Well, I was specifically talking about space being a nearly infinite heat sink, for example. The heated air dramatically cools it as it expands.
Yeah.
I think the other one is cooled particles could fall back onto Earth, neutralizing some of that heat as well.
Yeah.
And of course, the important one, and we all talk about the specific heat capacity of water. That's another factor that comes into play in terms of neutralizing the heat.
Yeah, I think it definitely plays a role in me reaching the conclusion that heat would not be able to transfer to the lower atmosphere in the way that so many critics believe that it did. And so far from critics that I've seen, what they do is they will just take a very simple thermodynamics equation that takes the specific heat of water times the mass of the atmosphere, and then they they solve basically for what would your final heat be if you added some percentage of kinetic energy that Walt estimates that the fountains needed in order to launch all the asteroids and comets and TNOs. So they'll just arbitrarily pick a seemingly really low percentage of that kinetic energy value, and then they'll apply it to this equation and come up with 3,000, or 300 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature of the atmosphere. But they've done that without and that's where they've oversimplified the problem, because they've done that without taking into account high speed flow has through a stagnant atmosphere. And that's really where they go wrong. They've oversimplified the problem, and so they've come up with an answer they like, but they've ignored a whole lot of very real physics that would be going on in the interaction between the high-speed hypersonic flow of the jetting fountains and the stagnant atmosphere.
So, Brian, could I ask you the temperature of the water in the subterranean chamber? Walt has indication of how hot the water would have been. And that's why the natural thought is, well, when it's up on the surface, it's going to scald all life to death, even those on the ark. But how hot would the water have been in the chamber when the fountains erupted?
Right. So there's some indications from meteorites having like the iron nickel meteorites having a Widmanstätten pattern in them, and they know that results, to get that, you need prolonged temperatures at 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. So a rough estimate is that the waters of the Great Deep started out below the crust at 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. And so many critics just assume that 1300 degrees Fahrenheit is what the atmosphere experienced. But remember, that's 60 to 30 miles below the crust where we're at 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. But when you allow a high temperature fluid to expand freely, we call that throttling in the engineering business. When it expands freely,
Hey, Brian, we're getting bad audio from you. Could you begin again? When it expands freely, what happens? Well, you don't have a good connection.
Here, let's try this.
Yeah, it looks like it was about maybe 5 or 6 seconds there with a bad connection, but it looks like, Brian, looks like you're back.
Yeah. How's that?
Good.
Okay. You'd asked about the high temperatures, 1300 degree Fahrenheit temperatures of the fountains of the Great Deep. And so many critics assume that 1300 degrees Fahrenheit will be what the atmosphere experiences. But remember, that's 30 to 60 miles below the surface where those temperatures exist. And when you allow a high temperature, high pressure fluid to freely expand, the expansion itself causes there to be a rapid cooling of the fluid as it accelerates, basically. So in the engineering business, we call that throttling or free expansion through a nozzle. And that is absolutely what happens. I mean, that's relied upon in the physics of a rocket engine or a jet aircraft or anything like that. It is known that when you freely expand a fluid, it is going to cool down. So by the time you expand a fluid 30 to 60 miles, it definitely would have cooled down and gained tremendous kinetic energy by that time. Now, the exact amount of cooling and what the exact temperature is of the flow as it passes by the atmosphere, the lower atmosphere, I can't positively tell you what that would have been, but it certainly wouldn't have been 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. If you look at the throat of a rocket nozzle, for instance, the temperatures right at the throat are extremely high. And if you follow a plot of how temperature changes as it passes through the throat of a nozzle, like say a rocket nozzle, and enters into the expansion chamber, which is kind of that bell-shaped part of a rocket nozzle, the part that you can see, we know that the temperature drops rapidly from the nozzle. So by the time it exits the bell chamber of the rocket, those temperatures have cooled a tremendous amount. So definitely not 1300 degrees at the surface of Earth in the lower atmosphere.
Are there any heat problems with the drifting of the continents in the model whatsoever?
Yeah, that's been talked about a lot. I think one of the strengths of hydroplate theory is its explanation of shallow magma under the continents, which I think is actually a problem for other forms of, I'll say, geophysical models. So I think you probably have heard about the fact that magma below the crossover depth cannot rise. So the idea that plumes of magma that could come from the super dense outer liquid core of Earth could rise through the mantle, that is a fantasy as far as physics is concerned. And so where do we get these big calderas like under the Yellowstone, under Yellowstone Park and things? How do we explain that? I think hydroplate theory's strength is in providing a very real mechanism for where that heat came from. So I don't see the heat being a problem for hydroplate theory, simply because, yeah, we have lots of areas where there's tremendous amount of magma somewhere down there about in the region where we would have expected the granite crust to have crashed into and skidded against the mantle for a certain length of distance, as it slowed down. And so that's where that heat came from. And then, yeah, it melted a whole bunch of rock. And of course, we have a whole bunch of evidence from volcanic mountains, especially for North America here along the western edge of the continent. A lot of those mountains are volcanic, like Mount St. Helens and whatnot. And of course, when they erupt, they send off not just magma, but tremendous amount of steam and carbon dioxide. So that again plays right in with the hydroplate theory as to where that heat came from, why there's all that pressure, why that pressure is still pressurized. And so, yeah, I don't see it as a big problem. When you have tremendous heat, rock also is a great insulator for things that are heat. So yeah, you might have a lot of heat built up under the surface of the continents as they drifted and slid and compressed during the compression event. But the heat that we have down there that we know is shallow really just points to the hydroplate mechanism as a very valid mechanism for that. And it explains why there's that heat at that point in Earth.
Actually,
Brian,
I'd be curious to ask, actually, if I can ask a real quick question, because everything you're saying is awesome and extremely helpful, Brian. We've got a critic who typically uses arguments from, I'm sure you're aware, Tony Reed, where they say that we require miracles. I don't know if they completely understood everything you were saying, because what you were saying kind of goes against that argument where they say only a miracle can resolve the so-called heat problem, if you want to call it that. Well, is there any validity to that with people like Tony Reed and the critics are saying?
In terms of needing a miracle for hydroplate theory to explain heat, I would say no, we don't need a miracle for that at all. That's I think a lot of that, at least from what I've seen of Tony Reed's commentary on hydroplate, there's definitely some misunderstanding of what hydroplate theory is saying, and I think his videos on the subject, to me, they don't convey that he has grasped what hydroplate theory is about, or the mechanisms in it. That, or he's glossing over. I won't speak for him, but that's what it seems to be. One of those two cases.
Right, I would agree with that. And then they'll say that the removal of the heat, the excess heat, they'll say that only a miracle can explain that, which once again, would you say misunderstands, as you were saying, they're oversimplifying it?
Yeah. In fact, I've been working on a video for about 2 years now to answer this question in a way that will convey the very real sciences behind thermodynamics and heat transfer, and the very real physical phenomena that's happening in the hydroplate scenario, so that there's a more thorough and accurate presentation of hydroplate theory's heat management, we'll call it, because it's not a heat problem. It's just how, these mechanisms generate heat. There's certain mechanisms in hydroplate theory that would generate heat, but then the question is how does that heat move through the system, and what what is our heat management say? And so it's not that there's a miracle required or that we have this amount of heat that we just don't know what to do with it. We know exactly how that heat moved around or would have moved around. I think critics tend to kind of jump to the problem before they've bothered to understand the physics that explains the problem.
Hey, Brian, is Walt Brown qualified to evaluate the heat implications of his hydroplate theory?
That's good. A good point. I don't know Tony Reed's background or some of these other people's pedigrees who are critiquing hydroplate theory. I mean, certainly physicists should be able to come up with I'll say a more realistic and more fair critique of a heat management of hydroplate theory. But Walt's a mechanical engineer, and I think anybody who's been in the engineering field and interacted with other engineering students, I know I went to Montana State University for my degree in mechanical, and mechanical engineers are one of the most entrenched in the field of thermodynamics and heat transfer of any of the engineering disciplines, really. I mean, other disciplines like, say, for instance, aerodynamics and civil engineering, a lot of times when you have to go to take your thermodynamics courses for your rubric in those fields, you are pretty much very likely going to be having a mechanical engineer as your professor for those classes, because thermodynamics is right out of mechanical engineering's wheelhouse. So Walt is eminently qualified for that. He graduated from a little podunk school called Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he graduated with his PhD there with a focus and emphasis on heat transfer. So Walt is by no means uninformed as far as the heat management in his own theory.
Walt actually worked in MIT's heat transfer lab, and he received his PhD from their heat transfer division in their engineering department. So he really is eminently qualified to consider, and he has throughout the entire development of his model for decades now, considered the heat generation and dissipation of the hydroplate theory.
Yeah, I think people hear mechanical engineer and it sounds like gears, but there's a whole half of the discipline that is dedicated to thermodynamics and heat transfer. So the big part of mechanical engineering.
You said that you were working on a video a while ago, but doing all the math calculations. Is that still in the works, or are you still more working on a book?
Well, I've been doing kind of a little of both.
And,
I will say I didn't. The video won't be all the math calculations. It'll have some calculations that just show the percentages of how much area is involved, and to give the viewer an understanding of things. It's a lot of things are very difficult to calculate, as far as like you just end up making so many assumptions that anybody could sit there and pick apart those assumptions. And so I'm a little hesitant to just, vomit a whole bunch of calculations into a video. I don't think it would help with understanding the concepts. The idea behind this video will be to show the physical interactions that have to take place, that we know would have taken place, and just show how those physical interactions are going to severely limit the amount of heat transfer that can happen with the lower atmosphere. And that's the main thing, because most everybody who's critiquing hydroplate theory will just immediately jump to a lot of adjectives describing how Earth would cook or boil or fry or whatever, and so the goal of this video is really just to educate as far as what type of physical phenomena were really truly involved in hydroplate theory, and show how you cannot just take some of the things that hydroplate theory proposes and then simplify it outside of what hydroplate theory proposes, and then come up with some supposed calculation that proves hydroplate theory has a problem. And that's really where I see most of the critiques having real difficulty in terms of being fair to what hydroplate theory is proposing.
Brian, one of the misconceptions is that this heat occurred on the first day. I mean, the flood occurred over 150 days.
Yeah, that's another.
Are they really taking into account that it wasn't over one day? It was over 150 days.
That's another thing that does come up. Even John Baumgartner has essentially done the equivalent of that, where when he's calculating the amount of energy it would take to produce, I think, all the deuterium that Walt claims, he says, well, if you'd have done that, you would have vaporized, the crust and the oceans and everything. Like, everything would have just been vaporized. And it's kind of interesting that he does that, because Walt, in his book, has a calculation where he did that very thing and said, yeah, if you take it over, zero time, then yeah, you add that much energy all at one time to, this much crustal mass and this much ocean and atmosphere mass, then yeah, it all vaporizes. But if you spread it out over 40 days, suddenly it's not a whole lot more intense than an LED light bulb. So time is a very important factor in this, and I think a lot of critiquers tend to skip that.
One of the questions from a critic was that a lot of the energy produced, Walt Brown said, was in the million, was 5,000 trillion H-bombs. And the question is on your screen right there. Love for you to ask what Walt Brown's high numbers are from the website, assuming a total energy of 2.2 times 10 to the 38th power. If you can see that anyway. But Walt Brown said something like 5,000 trillion H-bombs were going off. I don't know if that was during the fountains of the Great Deep breaking forth, and if that would be a numerical heat problem.
So I think that in context of the hydroplate theory, what Walt was, how he came up with those numbers was that he was just saying, how much energy would it take to get that much mass to exit Earth's gravitational sphere of influence? So it needs to be accelerated to at least 7 miles per second in order for material that exits in the fountains to never come back to Earth. And so that's how he arrived at that kinetic energy estimate. And so that would be, you could accelerate one rock at a time, or, one packet of water at a time, doing that. So yeah, those very large kinetic energy estimates are not something that all have to happen on like the first day. It happened over 40 days is what Walt claims.
I see. And that was kind of like the highest velocity to eject something like an asteroid would have been, to push it in.
That would have been the minimum velocity to get any object of any size, whatever its mass is, you've got to get that mass accelerated to 7 miles per second in order for it to leave Earth and not gravitationally be attracted back down to Earth. So you got to get outside the sphere of influence. So for it to go into orbit basically around the sun and not come back and orbit Earth or hit Earth, you've got to get above 7 miles per second. That would be the minimum velocity. And some near hyperbolic comets indicate that they might have been launched at up to 30 plus miles per second.
Hyperbolic, going retrograde as compared to the sun's rotation and the Earth and the planet's rotation.
Yeah.
Could we make two clarifications? One, when the debris was being ejected from the Earth by the fountains, the Earth didn't eject an asteroid. It ejected millions of boulders, rocks, tremendous amount of water, debris, and the asteroid formed over time in space. So one clarification. Earlier, I mentioned, I know I realized I misspoke, that the compression event, the continents sliding, I think I implied it happened after 40 days. It didn't. It happened months later in the flood.
Got it.
Yeah, that was that first one too, Bob. Thank you for that. That is a very good point. And one common misconception is that whole asteroids or whole TNOs or whatever were being launched. That those formed later. Basically, trillions of tiny, relatively small rocks were getting launched, but not extremely large house-size objects necessarily. Some of them might have been up to that. Like there is some indication that some meteorite, or I guess it'd be meteoroids, are spinning at a speed that would indicate that anything bigger than about 650 feet in diameter would probably fly apart. So up to say 650 feet in diameter, but no larger probably than that.
We have a really lousy short animation that we created. Maybe I could show that, but Bryan, I hate to ask, I'm not the host here, but could you describe that picture on the screen? Are those actually is that your watch?
Yeah. Yeah. That's my watch, and that's my hands, and that was at my kitchen table with a propane torch, that you'd use for soldering pipes. So that was an attempt to show how heat transfer works and doesn't necessarily transfer heat into the atmosphere in the way that many people would think, without going into a hour-long discussion in the Hydroplate series of videos. So that was just kind of, sometimes a picture's worth more than a lot of explanation, but apparently that wasn't the case, which is why I'm doing the video now to be a little more specific.
Could you keep your hands there for what, like 5 seconds?
Oh no, I could have let the whole bottle run out.
And the claim, like from Tony Reed and others, we list 20 of their specific heat objections. The claim that all this energy, it's just going to average out. And so that's not like a law of physics that the energy available averages out. And we use this, an actual photograph of a test, a rocket test, to make the point that just because you have thousands of degrees at the nozzle doesn't mean you have thousands of degrees 100 feet away.
Yeah, that's kind of a larger example of my hands in front of the propane torch. And that's one assumption, is that when you do these calculations using basically finding the mass involved in the energy and then solving for what your final temperature would be, well, that's assuming that you're getting perfect mixing. It's assuming that you even have a mechanism that allows mixing. And nobody who's criticized hydroplate theory has ever even bothered to talk about that. They just want to pick a percentage that they feel is reasonable, but they don't have any scientific justification for why it's reasonable. And so what I want to do with this video is show, if you go into the mechanisms, you see how arbitrarily picking a percentage is not so reasonable.
So if they said 1/10 of 1% of the exhaust energy was in that snow 100 feet away, it would have melted the snow. But right. In fact, that arbitrary percent is not relevant to the real world.
Yeah. And the further away you get, the harder and harder it is to mix. And so we're simplifying something into an experiment that maybe a first-year physics student does in a very controlled environment on their table, where you can wait, and if you add this much heat to your box that's well insulated, you can roughly get, some average temperature over time and conclude that, that works for that scenario, but that's in a very controlled and closed system. But now we're talking on a global scale. How do you get thorough atmospheric mixing to the point where you could conclusively say that some people in a boat at the surface would absolutely for sure die, and that becomes much more complicated. And so this video will show and highlight that, just very similar to, if you, I guess, wanted to use a solid rocket booster to melt snow, you'd have kind of a problem doing that on snow that's just not too far adjacent from the side of the nozzle that's at 8 or 10,000 degrees. So,
wow. Well, if the fountains came up with tremendous heat, that doesn't mean they're going to overheat the atmosphere.
Could you repeat that, Bob?
If the fountains did come up with tremendous heat, that doesn't mean they're going to overheat the atmosphere because of this directed energy and the way the real world works instead of back of the envelope calculations.
And the many will just take an arbitrary percentage of kinetic energy and then say, well, if that mixed with the atmosphere, everything would fry and boil. And even that, the equation they use, that's an average temperature, so you can't conclusively say that every single section of air in the entire atmosphere has for sure reached that temperature, especially when with the Earth you're dealing with an open system. So they're really not comparing apples to apples in that case.
Brian, you mentioned the escape velocity earlier. I read that the absolute zero is, I think, around 100 kilometers above Earth's surface. So considering the escape velocity, you'd reach that heat would reach zero in what, 2 to 5 or 10 seconds?
Yeah, certainly depending on the speed that was reached for a given pulse. I don't know I'm not sure the source that you're saying the temperature, the atmosphere, as far as altitude. You can look those things up with a Google search. I think temperature is a little misleading as far as going with what the temperature of the atmosphere is above the Earth. There's a lot of factors that affect that. And remember, temperature is just a way of telling us, giving us an idea of the heat of something. But you could have one molecule that's 5,000 degrees as far as its energy, its temperature. But if it struck you, unless it hit a nerve ending or something, you'd probably not notice damage from it, right? So it's when you have trillions of those molecules at that temperature with that amount of energy that it transfers into you and you get burned. So, and the reason I'm bringing that up is, a couple hundred miles above Earth's atmosphere, if you look that up on Google, you'll find that the temperature actually starts to rise the higher up you go in the atmosphere, as cosmic rays and stuff from the sun interact with the molecules that are up there. But those molecules are so spread out that there's not enough heat in all those molecules to heat something effectively. So the thing is that there's so much space, literally space, available between all those molecules that there's tremendous potential for something rising up through the atmosphere to be very, it's able to radiate its heat out because there's no atmosphere to interact with in general. There's not really that many molecules to interact with. So the more of that clouds as well, the more ejecta that is launched above Earth, the less and less the sun's rays are able to hit those molecules. They might hit the outer molecules and excite them, but the stuff that's behind it gets more and more shaded, we'll say, from Earth's rays, and so those have the ability to radiate their heat more effectively. So yeah, in terms of the launch speeds, material that was 1,300 degrees down at the base, if it gets accelerated to 7 miles a second, the lower atmosphere where all life is about 7 miles. So it would, if it was going 7 miles a second, by the time it had accelerated for 60 miles from the base, it would be traveling at 7 miles a second. So it'd be in Earth's atmosphere or passing through Earth's atmosphere in just 1 second. So it really wouldn't have much time to interact. And then there's a whole host of aerodynamic reasons why the high-speed flow from the fountains would not be able to interact with and mix with the essentially stagnant atmosphere just to the sides of the flow.
Yeah, thank you for that. I asked a question of Bob earlier, but he suggested I probably wait until you came in onto the stream. It's to do with the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. You aware of that at all?
Yeah, the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. Yeah.
Yeah, I know a bit about it, but I'm not sure the audience knows much. If you just like to expand on it a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. It's what's used in order to come up with the steam tables for water, and it's a relationship where the pressure and the temperature are related in such a way that if the pressure drops, then the temperature, in order for the equation to balance, has to drop. So that's, I guess, without going into, I think, a lot of detail that would probably be pretty difficult to follow, and maybe, at least for me right now, having not prepared specifically for that, might be difficult for me to even get through. But yeah, basically the two variables in the equation are pressure and temperature, and so if temperature or pressure drop, then the other variable also has to drop. And so to that end, the pressure in the fountains down at the base was extremely high pressure, and it was getting accelerated and dropping in pressure because of that acceleration and because of the expansion.
Yeah, Bob mentioned that when the fountains of the deep broke up, there was enormous erosion from the floor and the ceiling where the water was actually contained in. So what I'm saying is, when you have that much erosion occurring, the pressure above it is reduced, and therefore the temperature would drop as a result.
I guess I'm not quite following the erosion side of things. What was the thought there?
Well, consider the water contained under the crust. Okay, as it escapes, it's actually eroding the floor and the ceiling of that chamber. But as it's eroding that material, the pressure on that material is then less because there's less material above it. Therefore, the temperature would reduce as well.
The temperature of the, are you saying
of the water? Of the water.
Of the water?
If the overlying crust is going from 60 miles down to 50 to 40, then that's another factor in reducing the pressure. George, you're making that point?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I guess I have to think about that. You're talking about like the eroded particles in there going from high pressure to low?
No, well, the eroded particles would be removed, but the amount of material above it would be less because, as Bob mentioned, you'd go from 60 miles thick to 50 miles thick to 40 miles thick because you've had a lot of erosion from that ceiling of the chamber.
Okay, I think I'm understanding a little better now. So, and not only that, but as as the fluid starts to move, just by definition, in fluids, you study fluid mechanics. When a fluid starts to move, it by definition drops in pressure. I think is that what you're talking
Yes.
about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the fountains erupting, I believe Walt has calculated the pressure at about 370,000 pounds per square inch. Almost unimaginable. But then at the surface, 1 atmosphere is like 15 pounds per square inch. So a tremendous decrease in pressure from the movement of the water and the expansion of the water. That's got to be overwhelmingly the most significant factor, the decrease in pressure.
Yeah. In fact, if you think about it, if I was to describe a scenario and we weren't talking about the Earth, and I just said I have this box, and it's inside the box, the air in this box is at 300,000 psi, and I've got a little thin layer of air outside of this box that's an inch thick, and that's exerting some amount of pressure on this box. And then outside of that air, I've got a vacuum pulled on it. And now I'm going to open a fissure in this box and let all that air inside do whatever it wants to do. And on the one end, I have 300,000 psi. I've got an inch layer of stagnant air, and then I've got a vacuum pulled on it. What kind of speeds and accelerations and expansions do you think you're going to see?
Yeah.
I hope we just got a preview of a segment of your heat video, Brian.
Yeah, there's this part in there where I talk about it.
Okay. Hey, George and the guys, Donnie, Roa, Matt. Earlier we mentioned the comet formation. We've got a really rough draft of an animation. It's not for public consumption, really. It's unlisted on our YouTube channel. But maybe I could hit play here, and you guys could see this to sort of visualize the concept. Is that right? Okay, I'll hit play.
Yeah.
So the debris coming up from the crack that wrapped around the Earth, and they're all individual rocks, particles with water vapor, water turning to ice, and dust, tremendous amount of debris. Now the animation gets really rough here, I apologize. But imagine that's a rock that's the core, and other debris that's orbiting the core that'll become an asteroid or a comet. And so that happens over time. And then over a period of years, you end up with what's eventually going to be a comet. So that idea.
Yeah, I know SFT had a few more questions to ask. Maybe this is a good opportunity, Standing, to do that.
Yeah, no, I was just engaging the chat. I wanted to say thank you for the super stickers, super chats, both to Brian and Bob. This has been a blessing. I mean, we're going on almost 2.5 hours, and this has flown by. So much good information. This is extremely rewatchable. And like I said, just a lot of good data and a lot of good evidence that you guys are providing us. Now, I wasn't sure how, because we kind of went on a discussion on the heat and various related topics. I'm not too sure if Bob, I know the last time I'm not sure if there was a few other things you wanted to touch on, or in regards to the outline that we had laid out, or
well, we had evidence specifically, not only tremendous evidence for the global flood, but evidence for the hydroplate theory.
Right. Yes, that's what I'm looking at on the outline. That I didn't want to derail it. I wanted to make sure that you were feeling, Bob, that you were able to, get out everything that you felt necessary.
Yeah. So, Brian, I don't know what your time is like, but maybe we could just quickly go through some of these bullet points of evidence, not only for the global flood, like dinosaur soft tissue and trillions of dead things laid down by water, but specifically evidence for the hydroplate theory, that creationists really, I think, could celebrate so much evidence. Brian, you have a little bit of time to look at some of this?
Yeah, maybe a little.
All right. So we have 20 Bible verses that uniquely support the hydroplate theory, uniquely. And when other authors of the other creation models were asked, what Bible verses uniquely support like catastrophic plate tectonics or the impact model or the vapor canopy model, there's like one verse that seems like maybe it supports the vapor canopy theory, and no verses that support catastrophic plate tectonics. Like there's nothing that says that the edges of the continent began to plummet because they got 700 degrees cooler. You know what I mean? But so many verses seem to explicitly reference the hydroplate theory. The perfect cosmos now has cratered Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, and Mars. So God wouldn't have created the perfect solar system, the heavens, with all that damage. So Walt's model, the hydroplate theory, explains how the solar system itself was corrupt with the stain of sin, how the heavens are seeing the same kind of decay as the Earth. The perfect cosmos now has asteroids and comets flying around, and they're dangerous. They kill people. Meteors, like errant bullets. The near side of the moon pummeled with the Maria compared to the mostly sprinkled far side of the moon. The biological material out in the solar system, if anybody goes to kgov.com/evidence and clicks on that link, there are dozens of papers where there's so much evidence that there's biological material not only on comets, but in meteoroids and out in space. All the transient lunar phenomenon, that the moon got beat up very recently. Comets and asteroids and even meteoroids with diamonds in them made of common earth minerals. How do you get the temperature and the pressure to make diamonds in asteroids? Brian, earlier you mentioned that the feature of rock in meteorites, I can't pronounce the word, where you need very high temperature over a long period of time to create that feature in iron.
Yeah, the Widmanstatin pattern between iron and nickel, that's one of the signatures that tells you whether or not you have just a chunk of iron or whether or not you have a meteorite, say if you're out looking for meteorites.
Yeah,
tests.
Right. And the hottest temperatures in the largest asteroids don't get nearly to the temperatures that you need. The Earth's oldest rock, yep. NASA hid this for 50 years. They didn't announce it until this year. The Earth's oldest rock based on radioactivity was found on the moon. So how'd that happen? How did a rock from the Earth get to the moon? And why does it have that much evidence of radioactive decay? It's because of the fountains of the Great Deep. Rounded boulders form in energetic flood flows, yet thousands or millions of rounded rocks are in comets. The biggest crater system in the solar system is in the southern Aitken Basin of our own relatively tiny moon. That's because the moon was closest and it got beat up so severely. Bronze Age iron came mostly from meteorites. That's generally unknown to the creation community. When the Bronze Age was making knives and tools from iron, it was almost all from meteorites, they're iron. And how could it be? Today, you wouldn't be able to sustain an industry if you're making tools only from meteorites. But after the flood, there was way more debris in Earth's orbit that rained down on our surface. Space debris thins out as you travel from Earth to the asteroid belt, you don't get more and more debris. You get less and less debris because the debris came from the Earth. That's why most debris in the solar system is in Earth's orbit. And it goes on and on. This list, these are extraordinary pieces of scientific evidence that gives powerful evidence, like swaths of missing crust in the Atlantic and a massive granitic crust below the Pacific. So guys, we could continue, but the mile deep sediments that blanket the continents, they had to be eroded from below because neither the vapor canopy nor catastrophic plate tectonics can explain where the sediments came from. So I think that's enough. There's a lot more.
Yeah, well, I was saying in the chat, Bob, that even though we've gone for 2.5 hours, because people are loving this, and we've actually got some fellow brothers and sisters and fellow young Earth creationists in the chat that aren't familiar with the HPT model. So already they've begun to download and order the book in the beginning. And I pointed out that even after 2.5 hours, we've only touched on maybe 1% of all the evidence for the model. So
yeah, exactly. And Walt's book is truly extraordinary, and it's his latest contribution is the origin of Earth's radioactivity, and he truly is the Isaac Newton of our day. And I think he needs to be honored, and he's so often attacked. Because he's the one who explained to the creation movement that the vapor canopy theory is not valid. It's not scientific and it's not biblical. So he took one for the team because the team loved the canopy theory. But now, decades later, the whole creation movement, at least all the big groups, they all acknowledge Walt was right, but it caused a rift. And once a relationship spoils, it's hard to repair it. So, but Walt really gets the credit for helping the creation movement in immeasurable ways.
I would like to say one thing that's kind of off topic, as in we discussed it earlier with the lightning strikes and how, because for the critics and a couple comments in the chat saying kind of just dismissing it, but the Z pinch, hasn't it been observed in the lightning strikes where the heavier nuclei have actually been created? Like this has been observed, and so
well, this is
they're outright dismiss. Right. So they're just dismissing that which is empirical and has been observed.
Yeah, lightning bolts create radioactivity. Scientists discover, which is hysterical because they discovered it where tens of thousands of Walt's readers knew about this for 10 years.
Right. So these heavy elements were being made in the Earth's crust during Noah's flood, and for them to just wave it away, because we've had a few comments from critics, and I'm just thinking, like, were they listening to that portion? And
I'm sorry for interrupting, but
no, that's okay. Go ahead, Bob.
Here's the journal Nature. Lightning makes new isotopes. Physicists show that thunderstorms trigger nuclear reactions in the atmosphere. November 22nd, 2017. So, there's a lot that we discover in the world of science, and it's understandable that not all scientists and people who are interested, they can't be up on everything.
Right.
But Walt Brown students, they're up on way more than anyone else. All these discoveries, all scientists work for Walt Brown, and Walt Brown was here, his model is right. Therefore, his predictions are confirmed to an extraordinary degree, and he's made many outstanding explicit predictions that we know are going to be confirmed because his model has been confirmed by the scriptures and by the fulfilled predictions.
Amen. And like we said earlier, the gold standard of science, especially for any working hypothesis, is to make testable predictions that are both future and falsifiable. And I mean, we touched on a massive number of them today. So this has been phenomenal. George, I think you're about to say something, brother. I apologize.
Yeah, I was going to say we often hear from the atheists and evolutionists that if we ask them a question, they say, "Oh, we don't know, but we'll find out at some point in time because we know there's a naturalistic explanation." However, when we say it, somehow that debunks creationism, and I find that a bit funny though, because it's a double standard, if you like, you know.
Now, Bob, a lot of these testable predictions that Dr. Walt Brown that he's put forth in regards to the model, many of them have actually been confirmed and come true.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
right. And it's on Walt's website. We make it super easy. rsr.org/predictions. We list his predictions, the confirmed ones, and then we link
Right.
to his book.
Because a lot of critics too that say, you know, it's almost like a full-time job criticizing and objecting to young Earth creation. They'll say, sure, you can make testable predictions all the time, but none have been confirmed. But that just shows that they're not up to date on the fact that no, many of them have actually been confirmed as well.
So many. If they go to that page, it will make them sick to their stomach.
Maybe it's why they avoid the page.
If they're rebelling against creation science, they will hate to see all the explicit predictions confirmed.
Right, right. So when they say that none have been confirmed, it just shows that they're not up to date. As you said, one final thing I'd ask then, with the Proton 21 lab, I've had a couple people say that they've they're saying it's disappeared. Are you familiar with this or what?
Well, it closed down. Brian, maybe you know more, but yeah, it closed down.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about. I guess I actually wasn't even aware of it, so I'm not up on that. But it certainly was in operation at some point, and
right. It doesn't negate the data.
Yeah, it does. A very good point. It doesn't negate their results or what they found.
Well, not only that, but at Sandia National Labs, they began to, science, observable, reproducible. They began to reproduce their results, and their initial, and not only there, but in the US, in Russia, Germany, Sweden, at the Department for Applied Physics and Electronics at Umeå University, they are getting preliminary results that are consistent with the Proton 21 published papers. And at Sandia, they said, and I could, I think I could pull up the paper, but here, Proton 21 experiments in the Ukraine and at US Sandia National Labs, I'll click on that and see what we get. On our website, we link to the original sources thousands of times. And here, November 2009, and if you go through and read this like we have, they are very optimistic. Their data is consistent that Z-pinch will create elements, and they ask for, unsurprisingly, a government lab, they ask for more money to further their research. And if that money ever materializes, we know that it's going to show that Proton 21 was spot on.
Right. Great point. I've heard you, Bob. I think it was in that recent show actually that you had with Brian about the heat problem, where one of the predictions with the mammoths, somebody said that was a prediction that Dr. Brown made, and it was falsified due to where some mammoths were found. And I remember you refuting that claim. I just can't remember exactly what you said. It was
Yeah.
Could you touch on that real quick? Because somebody is saying, why do we find mammoths below oil then, which formed during hydroplate?
Okay. So, and Brian, you might recall better, but there was a paper written by a creationist, very well-known creationist, and he's going to publish that falsifying Walt's prediction because we found fossils below in the Arctic Circle, below sedimentary layers. I'm trying to recall the details. Walt contacted the author and pointed out, because thankfully he got a courtesy copy. I wish that happened more often. This is a famous creationist, and I hesitate to say his name, but he misread the sedimentological maps, and he was wrong about the location. So that paper was not published. Now, perhaps someone commenting knows more about that or a different case, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, what you just said, Bob, is exactly what I remember from that show. So I got to say, gentlemen, I mean, we're going on 2 hours and 40 minutes, and this has been amazing. I'd love to have you on again, Bob. I mean, we've only touched on 1% or maybe even less of the evidence and what we could say about HPT. But I don't want to keep you guys any longer. This has been a blessing. I really appreciate the time that you gentlemen, you brothers, have given to us. You've been a blessing to not only us, but also our listeners, our faithful listeners. We've had a very good audience the entire time. So God bless you guys. I want to give you gentlemen the final words, and George, of course, if you want to say anything as well before I think we shut it down for the day.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for coming to our show, but also please feel free. I'll volunteer Standing for Truth to come on to your radio show.
Okay, we will do that. I take you guys up on that, so we'll book it.
Good.
Book it, Daniel.
Awesome. That's awesome. You guys are a blessing. Once again, thanks for giving us your time. You guys can have the floor for some final words. And Brian, I know you were at work, so we appreciate you making your way in here and giving us so much good information on some very technical questions. So extremely helpful. And I'm going to probably rewatch this tonight because so much good information, guys.
So Brian, you have anything? I know you got to go.
Yeah, I guess I'll give a shameless plug for anybody who wants a little more information that comes from my perspective on interpreting hydroplate theory, and helpful information in terms of understanding it would be to go to my YouTube channel just under my same name. My name is spelled with a Y, and look that up. And there's several hours of content there that should help anybody who wants to get a little better understanding of hydroplate theory, get them up to speed pretty well.
Amen, Brian. I was just watching your series again last night, actually, in preparation for this, and I can't recommend it enough. So I'm going to also put that in the description box of this video, so people will know where to go easily. So I appreciate that. Yeah,
you bet.
And Bob, I'll leave it up to you for some final words, and thanks again.
Well, I couldn't more highly recommend Brian's videos, and we link to them constantly from our website, and especially his video on the origin of Earth's radioactivity. That's Walt's latest contribution, and it's a brilliant discovery. He deserves a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the origin of uranium. Walt Brown was
Amen.
Prize. And on our website, if you notice, we've got HPT. Notice that doesn't say HTTPS. Well, that's on the left, but you could ignore that. HPT.rsr.org. Walt has given us permission to reproduce his website here. And so home, online book, which is HTML, the flip book, which is so fun to read, and a downloadable PDF, in an HPT store where you can get really fabulous hydroplate theory resources. Mike Snavely, Mike's mission imperative, he is the home of the upcoming 9th edition of Walt's book. So the hardcover book will be available from Mike Snavely. And I know Brian Nickel, it's his passion, but to get out this heat video on Walt's model, and we will continue with God's help and blessing to produce resources. See Brian's Origin of the Grand Canyon right there, that stunning video that you can see on his website, and you can get right here from the Hydroplate Theory store. So it's all there. And we're thrilled that you guys are fighting the fight, and we're thrilled to stand alongside you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Brian. I've watched your videos numerous times.
Yeah, well, that's I go back and watch them a lot too, just to remind myself of stuff. So yeah.
Good on you, mate.
Well said, gentlemen. Thank you again. The chat had a great time. I had a great time. I learned so much. So looking forward to having you gentlemen back on in the future. And thanks so much for all you do, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for men like you that we can learn so much from. So anyways, God bless you and God bless the chat. Thank you so much, guys, for sticking with us for nearly 3 hours. Time has flown by.